Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Super Deep Movie Analysis. My name is Lec Zorn. I'm joined by guest co-host Michelle Gussow, and in this episode we continue our preview of the upcoming Rocky sequel titled Creed. Last episode, episode 4, we super deep analyzed the original 1976 Rocky. Now we move up 3 years later to Rocky 2. And Michelle, that came out at a time when sequels were just starting to become a regular Hollywood practice. You know, it's hard to believe that it wasn't until 1974 when The Godfather Part 2 became the first movie ever to have a sequential title. That's ironically also starring Talia Shire. And prior to that, sequels were not only pretty rare, but they always had completely different titles so that you wouldn't know from the title that it was a sequel to the earlier film. So, anyway, it was almost inevitable that there was going to be a Rocky sequel, and of course now we were about to have the 6th sequel coming out. But, when you look at what became of the sequel practice in the 80s and the 90s, where it exploded to a sometimes ridiculous extent, where you had a lot of instances of having sequels simply for the sake of having sequels because Hollywood discovered they were safe investments, what you had was really a lot of films that simply rehashed the original. And when you rehash a movie, at best you're going to end up with a second-rate version. We've seen a lot of that, and and worse. Right. But I think that one thing that Stallone has successfully done throughout the Rocky series, while there have been flaws with all the sequels, he generally has done a great job keeping the character of Rocky growing, and with a couple of exceptions, really doing a good job keeping the story interesting and moving in logical and compelling directions.
Absolutely. I do have to say, what's interesting is that at the time, and even looking back, I keep seeing Rocky 2 as the sequel that really shouldn't have happened, but was definitely necessary if Stallone was going to tell the rest of the story, meaning 3 and 4 and on.
Yeah, and I like the movie. When I watched it the other day, again for the first time since the 90s, I liked it more than I remember liking it before. It has its flaws, but certainly it's necessary. And I think one of the first things that struck me is that a lot of what happens in Rocky 2 is simply the logical next step of the story in many ways. And so we start off at the end of the original, as does 4 and 5. So 3 of the 5 sequels start where the last one ended, and so Rocky and Apollo go to the hospital, and we instantly get a backtrack on the ain't gonna be no rematch line.
Well, absolutely, and actually I think that is one of the things that is contrary to what happened in the original, but not so contrary to Apollo Creed's character.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, he's not being pummeled anymore. He's not in the ring, and he's had that ambulance ride to kind of process everything and think about it.
Yeah, and his, one thing that we learned about Apollo is that, despite his great achievements, he cares too much what other people think about him. So as soon as he finds out that people think that he didn't really win, then of course, he's going to want to save face.
Yeah, and I guess that's when the reporters are starting to throw that at him. And he's getting the first inkling that that's what people think.
But Rocky, of course, the rematch is the furthest thing from his mind at first. He goes about his life, and one of the first things he does is propose to Adrian, which was, of course, the logical next step in their relationship.
But actually, getting back to the hospital, one of the interesting things about Rocky, to me, it's a very to me emotional and actually critical scene when he gets out of bed and goes to Apollo's room and says, "Did you give me your best?"
Yeah, that was a great scene.
And there was a thing to that, because with all of Apollo Creed's huffing and puffing, he could have lied.
Yeah.
He could have lied and said, "No, chump, I didn't give you my best, and rematch, and that'll show you what my best really." I mean, he could have done that and left Rocky feeling less than he'd accomplished, which of course we discussed before. Winning to him was going the distance and still being on his feet.
Yeah.
And that would have crushed him if he'd learned Apollo hadn't given him his best.
Yeah.
And Apollo was honest and told him, yeah, I did.
Well, I'm glad you went back to that, but when I started to skip over about when I went ahead to the marriage proposal. But yeah, that was a crucial scene, and there was certain innocence, like almost like a child with Rocky asking the question, which happens throughout the series, even in Rocky Balboa. In fact, Stallone even said that in the Rocky Balboa audio commentary, that the character is sometimes childlike, but still gets his point across. And he was actually referring to the scene where he mentioned that in over the scene where Rocky is denied a fighting license, which of course we'll get to 4 episodes from now.
Yeah, right.
But as for back to the hospital, yeah, it was a really touching scene, and so Rocky wanted to just verify the validity of what had just happened, but anyway, then he moves on, and
of course, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
As an aside too, just so people know, it's interesting because you see Rocky having surgery done from the beating he took, and that also helps to explain away some of the cosmetic surgery Stallone had through the years. So I just had to drop that in.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's a good. I never thought about that one. That's a good observation. That's why it's good to have a second person here for some of these shows. But
thank you.
Oh, no problem. I'm glad you pay such attention to details, and there's more that I'll get into later on too that maybe you haven't noticed, but. So anyway, Rocky proposes to Adrian at the zoo on a cold winter's day.
Right.
It hasn't been more than a few weeks since the fight, and he proposes in a typical Rocky way. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind marrying me very much.
I loved that.
Yeah, and so they get married in a very small ceremony. Mickey's there, Gazzo, and just a couple other people. It's a really small, modest ceremony, and. I'm not sure if Father Carmine, the priest, I'm not sure if he was speaking Latin or Italian. I can't tell the difference between the two, but it wasn't English. I know that. Right. But anyway, so they start off their married life in typical uneducated pro athlete fashion. That Rocky goes off on a spending spree, and
my personal favorites. He buys the car he can't drive.
Yeah, and then of course buys. The watches for himself and Adrian, and even his ingrate brother-in-law Paulie.
Right.
And of course the watch would be referenced 2 more times in the series in 3 and 6, and so it's interesting how sometimes like bit details that Stallone was able to bring back in the later sequels.
Right.
That you'd have to really be a diehard fan to recognize, like or like down to like you bringing back Spider and Marie in the last one, but so anyway, then you see right off that Adrian is someone who's more down to earth than Rocky. That she doesn't have her head in the clouds. I mean, she's trying to talk him down from all these spending binges.
Oh yeah, and even though I think it's one of these things too we talked about before, he's never really had money.
No,
and it's like new. It's like the money itself is like the new toy.
Oh yeah.
He's got it to spend. He can finally get whatever it is he wants without question, and not quite realizing that it's going to run out.
Yeah, and I saw a statistic recently. I think it said it's like 60% of basketball and 75% of. I mean, and I don't just mean any basketball. I mean NBA and NFL players. That's like 60% of one and 75% of the other are broke within a few years of retiring. I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's pretty high. So it's very believable that Rocky would go through all the money that quickly, and despite Adrian trying to stop him, but so then he gets stuck with the bills, and so he has to get a job again. At first he rules out fighting, especially after he visits Mickey, who discourages him. And
and it's important to note how Mickey discourages him.
Mm-hmm.
He basically says, "You get killed."
Yeah.
And he does that little demonstration where he goes to, I hit him, and he said, "You didn't see that coming."
Right.
And so it was really worried about Rocky's health, his well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes into play a little bit for me later, and we get somewhere else. I'll save that. But it's important to notice that that's why he says no.
Yeah, oh yeah. Mickey was looking out for him,
Right.
I mean, just even as cranky as he was, he did, he did take a protective, role,
Right.
Over his fighters. And, but, I got a little bit ahead of myself when I talk about Rocky getting stuck with the Bills, because before that, this was a good contrast. It shows Rocky out, enjoying his brief high life after, his, after his, going the distance against Apollo, and then you see Apollo, in his mansion, while his kids, run across, the living room, which is the only time you ever see his kids in the series up until the new Creed movie. And basically, you see Apollo reading hate mail, and he's eating it up, and his wife, who returns in part 4. Is trying to discourage him, and it's asking him, wouldn't he rather play with his kids, and
Right.
but he would rather read hate mail, and and take it to heart.
And yeah, absolutely take it personally. And also, it's an interesting thing because you're seeing that because of that mail, because of what people are saying to him, because of that feedback, he can't even enjoy his great big mansion and all the possessions he has.
Right.
So here he's got all this material stuff and can't enjoy it because of some words of some people he doesn't even know.
Yeah, and the Rock and Marianne Creed, by the way, Apollo's wife, played by Sylvia Meals, who has a very modest resume. Well, I looked her up, and she only has 4 IMDb credits, and 2 of them are Rocky 2 and 4.
Yeah.
And
just as an aside, I always thought Michelle Obama looked like her.
Yeah, so if they ever make a movie about the Obamas, they'll have to pull her out of retirement wherever she is if they can find her.
Right.
Yeah, and who knows if they can or not, but. And the character of Marianne Creed is returning for the movie Creed, but this time played by
Felicia Rashad.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So and one other thing I'm unclear about is whether the little boy who ran across the house in that scene in Rocky 2 is the same character who's the same character in the new Creed movie, or if Apollo had a son later, because if it is really Apollo's son, then he would be in his late 30s now, or early 40s. So, whereas Michael B. Jordan, who plays Creed, I think is quite a bit younger than that. So,
yeah, and there's a limit to when Apollo could have had another kid.
Yeah, as recently as 85. So he could have been like a newborn then, and maybe be about 30 now. So that would fit. But yeah, of course, his children were never named.
No.
You only see him for about 3 seconds, running across the room
Right.
there. But so anyway, then Rocky starts to look for work, and we find out that his highest level of education completed is 9th grade,
Right.
which is a stretch compared to the way he talks. I was thinking more like maybe 4th or 5th, but anyway, so he finds out he can't get an office job like he wants, and what's really interesting is that he and Paulie do a job trade. For some reason, Paulie starts going off and working for Gazzo,
right.
collecting, and as Gazzo makes his final appearance in the series, sadly, although I'm not really sure what his place would have been had he been in any of the sequels, but he died the year before Joe Spinell died the year before Rocky 5 came out. Otherwise, it would have been a nice way to bring him back, but I guess they didn't want to bring him back played by another actor, maybe. But anyway, so we never see Paulie in action. I'm not sure he would have been quite as intimidating going after the.
No, probably not.
Yeah.
He probably had his own method. I wouldn't know what.
Yeah.
Just annoy them to the point where here.
Right. Yeah, maybe. I mean, you could, get him in a drunken rage and with a baseball bat, maybe. But
Yeah. But Rocky ends up at the meat packing.
Yes,
plant.
exactly. So they traded jobs. Though it was very brief. He gets laid off because of lack of seniority, and
Right.
I wonder if anybody ever became a vegetarian because of that collage where you see him working at the meat packing. That doesn't look very appetizing when you see it in that form. But
No.
so, but anyway, so basically Rocky is found only at most a few weeks worth of menial labor after the fight. So then he ends up selling his car to Paulie,
Right.
and
And
then
Adrian ends up at the pet store back
Yeah.
where she started out.
yeah, that's right, and not quite as shy this time, but Oh, and of course she turns up pregnant, so they didn't waste any time in trying to get to know each other first, you know.
There you go.
And so, in fact, I figure that the conception had to take place pretty quickly because even though we know Rocky Jr. was premature, you know, we know it was only like 10 months between the two fights, and he was born between. We know they married between the two fights,
right.
So they didn't waste any time.
No.
So anyway, so Adrian's now pregnant and doing this manual labor there at the.
And Rocky's at the gym. He's at Mickey's gym.
Yeah, and then meanwhile Apollo, you know, his camp is trying to talk him into moving on, but he's obsessed with the rematch with Rocky. And
oh yes, because Duke starts listing other fighters or something, and he's even telling Apollo, you know, I saw you beat him like you've never beat anybody else. He just kept getting up, coming back for more. You don't need that.
Yeah.
But
so yeah, that was a you know, and again, you know, a great example of Tony Burton, you know, who, like I said last time, is probably the most underrated person in the series. You know, he's in all 6 movies, adds a little something special to each one of them, and yeah, he's taken a protective role over Apollo, just like Mickey over Rocky, and then of course like Duke would later do over Rocky in the later sequels. Anyway, then Apollo. You know, he's interviewed by Brent Musburger, who has a nice cameo as himself. That was cool. You know, you have I'm trying to think how many real sports people play themselves in the series. You got Joe Frazier in the first one. Then you have Mike Tyson in the 6th one, and then Brent Musburger, and then actually a lot of the commentators.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think all the commentators in the last one.
And the guy in the ring too.
Yeah, Lou Filippo.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Couldn't think of it.
Yeah, and then Stu Nahan, I think, commentates in all the first 5. I know Lou Filippo does refereeing in each of the first 5.
Right.
So then you know, so basically after, you know, the Brent Musburger interview, then Apollo starts his smear campaign to try to embarrass Rocky into doing it, and then by that point, you know, he knows he needs the money. And
right. The other thing that comes into it, though, is that there's that scene where Mickey's watching it.
Yeah, and that's the scene that converts Mickey.
Right, and what's interesting about that is my reaction is he gets all fired up and angry and goes to see Rocky, you know, kind of a let's do this mode.
Yeah.
And it's like, so you're not worried about him getting hurt beyond repair anymore. So in a way, I think a lot of Apollo's blathering, Mickey took it personally.
Oh, he did,
as the trainer, you know, so that he had to come back and prove that Rocky wasn't a joke.
Yeah.
That he'd really trained a winner.
Because I think Mickey took it as an insult to him as well, you know.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like for me as a father, if somebody were putting down one of my kids like that, it would fire me up, you know. And I think another thing is I think a lot of trainers really view their fighters as almost as their children, you know. Or
extensions of themselves.
That could be as well, yeah. You know,
because I mean, if it's your child, if it was something like that, you definitely put your children's safety above anything else, and that's what you'd get fired up about. And since the reason Mickey turned down Rocky about training and fighting Apollo at first had to do with Rocky's safety.
Yeah.
Now that was sort of taking a back seat. So I think there was it was a little personal there. And that's just an observation again.
No, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, that's a good assessment. And you know, you look at I think if you look at boxing trainers in general, you know, often they serve as surrogate fathers, because a lot of these people who go into boxing, you know, their fathers aren't around, you know. And so one thing about the character of Rocky, you know, he shows the picture of his parents. I don't think they're ever explicitly said to be dead, but you assume that they are, since they're nowhere to be seen, or they're never mentioned in the present tense. Apparently, he had no siblings either,
right.
Which is pretty rare for for an Italian family to only have one child.
And that's why family is very important to Rocky in general.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody he becomes close to.
Exactly, yeah. So, like, for example, a real life example, like Mike Tyson, for example, who I believe has never met his father, and I think there's uncertainty about the identity of who his father even is, but supposedly one thing that really set him on the wayward path was when his trainer died when he was in his late teens or early 20s, and he lost his focus after that and then started getting involved in crime and everything. But, yeah, and then, of course, there was the line in Rocky IV where, Duke says that he Apollo was like my son, I raised him, and when he died, a part of me died. So you see that personal, connection between the trainer and the fighter. And so, obviously, Mickey now wants Rocky to do it, but of course, Adrian is against it. And, it was a scenario that was repeated really in Rocky IV, where she's against it until you get close to the climax, and then she finally changes her mind.
Oh, yeah. And that goes to me, I mean, yes, I understand her concern.
Yeah.
But she does know who she married. She knows that deep down that's who he is.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for whatever reason to even explain to somebody, well, I'm worried about your health. So don't pursue what your love is. It's kind of difficult to do that.
It is, and one thing that I liked about the sixth one, of course, we'll get to later, but in a nutshell, it's when Marie right off the bat tells him to go for it, for the fight against Dixon, when other people are trying, including his son, are against it, Yeah. So that shows just a fundamental difference between Marie and Adrian.
Right.
And so anyway, but yeah, so that's like I said, Adrian, she spends the bulk of 2 and 4 being against him continuing to fight. Until changing her mind, and of course in both cases as we'll get to a little later on, in both cases it's when she changed her mind that's an emotional lead-in to a training montage.
Right. Very good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
well, in that case too, he wasn't as without her support he was training, but he wasn't quite as focused as he could have been.
Right. Yeah.
And then the situation where I guess you were talking about where she collapsed in the pet store and ended up in the hospital and delivering prematurely.
Right.
And then in a coma. Had him thinking he'd go her way.
Right.
And then somewhere in the coma it changed her mind.
Yeah.
So
but before we get to that, though, a few other things happened, and of course we will get into more into that later. But so basically, they agree to the fight, and I get a kick out of the press conference that Rocky's just taking everything as a joke, like when they ask him how he likes it, that the fight's going to be at the Spectrum, where Apollo says he wants to have it so he can beat, this club fighter in front of his hometown fans, and then they ask Rocky how he likes it. He said that he likes it because it's only 10 minutes from his house,
right.
and he's just, and he just makes a joke out of everything while Apollo's trying to take everything super seriously. And one thing I've noticed over the years
is... Well, that's just in reverse of what happened in Rocky, because Rocky was taking it seriously and didn't know it was a joke, and Apollo was treating it as a joke.
Yeah.
So,
but, I've noticed one thing with people who are full of self-importance, the worst thing, from their perspective, the worst thing you can do is laugh at them, and not take them seriously. And that's what gets them even more mad, which of course it did with Apollo. And then of course you saw in a way you saw that in 4, when Drago, you can tell that he gets really mad by the way Apollo's talking at the press conference, and how much English, Drago understood that's uncertain, as we'll get to in that episode. But so that's 3 times where you had in the series where somebody's taking the fight super seriously, the other as a joke. And so anyway, Paulie is someone who, compared to the original, is pretty well behaved in part 2, except for of course one scene. Previously, he seems like he's settled down, and he's, we don't see him do a lot of boozing in the film, but then, they need some drama, so he comes in and has that argument with Adrian that leads to her collapsing there. and then well,
I guess he was. Yeah, he was saying, she was going to get him killed in the ring or something to that. Was it that?
It's something like that.
Yeah, because he wasn't. As I was saying, he wasn't really concentrating on the training. His mind was not 100% on it. And I think for a fight training, your mind must be 200% on it.
Yeah, exactly. And so they have that argument, and then so Adrian collapses there in the pet store, and she goes into a coma, and so the baby's born, prematurely, but okay. And
Right.
then Rocky decides that he's not going to see the baby until Adrian wakes up, and then.
Yeah, which I guess it's one of those things that's supposed to seem touching or
Yeah, I
whatever.
guess, yeah.
And I always started thinking with that is, okay, it worked out. She wasn't in the coma that long.
Yeah.
But if he decided he really wasn't going to see this baby until she woke up and she's in a coma for a month, I felt like here's this poor baby who isn't getting parental love, attention for this period of time when it's so crucial.
Yeah, and that's one thing, we could do a whole episode on that subject away from this movie, but yeah, that's, I mean, a really tragic example. You remember David Vedder, the boy from Texas who was born without an immune system and never had physical contact.
Right.
He was, and it came out after his death that despite the way he was portrayed by the media, he was very poorly adjusted. He was very angry because of his lack of human contact. It was a very, very, very sad story, but anyway. As for this movie, then Rocky asks for a chapel, and he goes into the chapel, and you see him pray, and it's interesting, there is in this and as well in 6 there's quite a bit of overtly Catholic content, and I've read about Stallone, and apparently he's been up and down. He was like all Italians practically. He was raised a Catholic, but his own faith has been up and down over the years, and it seems like at the 2 times when he made the 2nd and 6th one, it seemed to be pretty strong because there were a lot of references to the faith in that film. But it doesn't seem like it's really. I rarely ever read any negative comments about it. I think people accept Catholicism is just such a huge part of the Italian culture, and
also I think he did it in a way that didn't sound like he was touting it as something everybody else needed to do.
Yeah, that's true as well.
So,
yeah, it's never preachy. I mean, it's
yeah, you can see that's part of his character, and he doesn't expect it to be part of the audience character.
Yeah, although it is considering that what we learned about Mickey in part 3, it is interesting to see Mickey there for a time with him in the chapel, but we'll get to that in the next episode.
Well,
but so anyway, Adrian wakes up, and then we have one of the great mushy moments of the series. And from here on out, we're going to be discussing the climax, so you might want to turn it off right now if you haven't seen the movie and don't want to know what happens the rest of the way, and maybe tune back in after you've seen it. But so then they see the baby together, and they decide to by the way, is it ever established how long she was in the coma?
I don't think they ever said, and really I couldn't tell, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
as many times as I've seen it, I haven't been able to tell.
Yeah, I think there are some
so
things.
If anybody out there watching this has actually been able to tell from some reason, let us know.
Yeah.
Please share your views with us. I mean.
Yeah, because there are certain things like we'll get to in part 5. You really don't know how much time has elapsed, between some key events in the film.
Right.
But and I don't think it's problematic either. I mean, I'd say probably somewhere in the neighborhood of a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. I don't think months or anything like that. But it's one of those things that I mean, it doesn't create any big plot holes or anything.
Right.
But so anyway, they decide that they turn down Paulie's suggestion to name the baby Paulie.
Paulie,
So they instead name him after the father, and then Rocky offers to quit boxing, but then of course Adrian says that she just wants him to do one thing, and then he asks what that is, and she says win. And then, of course, Mickey has one of his great lines in the film, "So what are we waiting for?" And then, it's interesting, like in part 4, we actually get a 2-in-1 training scene, like when we have training montage in Hearts on Fire, the song training montage, that is, and Hearts on Fire back to back. And then in this one, we have Going the Distance and Gonna Fly Now back to back. And, they, Going the Distance being the fight music from the first one, during the Rocky Apollo fight. And I like that they opened with that, because that's such an intense song, and it really underscores the, the level of training that he's doing, that he really wants this now,
Right.
And it establishes a level of intensity I don't think they could have done just by another Gonna Fly Now montage. And I'm trying to think what he's doing. I don't remember if he's at the beginning of the montage, almost in sync with the music, almost like it's an instrument. He's there's some kind of is there some kind of manual labor tool that he's using, like he's in some kind of outdoor setting?
Well, I know he's chasing a chicken.
Well, yeah, he does that. Yeah,
outdoors.
Yeah.
I remember that.
I don't remember exactly. I'll have to go look at it again. But I remember it was something that was I thought really added to the intensity and went well with the music. And it's interesting that in like I said, 4 of the 5 movies in the series, we get a training montage. In 4 of the 5, it's set to Gonna Fly Now, in whole or in part. And it's really tough to when you're doing a training montage in every movie, especially largely to the same music, to not make it a rehash. But I think throughout the series, I think everyone is great. Everyone works really well,
Right. And you see that. Well, what I was saying is, like, Mickey using some different training methods. The other thing, of course, is he was training Rocky to fight right-handed.
Yeah.
And then wanted him to switch up. So he had that whole thing where he's got the one arm tied down and he's got him hitting the bag. And so he was training him a whole different way. To not fight southpaw. And so and you see him running with it. So there were different methods you saw being used, and they gave a good reason for it again too. As they had that, but of course, with the Gonna Fly Now, they had him running and everybody joining him.
Yeah.
That was the thing where everybody was joining him.
Yeah.
And
so, they had a different twist in every one,
right.
But just like in 4, where you between the 2 training songs, that Adrian shows up, so there's another lead in there to
right.
to the music. And then this time, right after Going the Distance, you see the brief scene of him at home with his newborn son, and then he walks out the door. That's when they start Gonna Fly Now. And it's interesting, by the way, in each of the 4 films, it's a different recording. Every time Gonna Fly Now is played for the training montage, it's a different recording. And even at the end of 5, when they play it, that's a different recording too. So, and of course this time, because you have so many children joining him as he's running, you have the children singing the vocals this time. And then so finally, we get to the fight at the Philadelphia Spectrum, and it's interesting. I haven't checked to see whether this one was actually filmed at the Spectrum or not, because the first one was actually filmed, even though it was supposedly at the Spectrum, it was actually filmed at the Los Angeles Sports Arena, which was the home for several years of the Los Angeles Clippers basketball team. But anyway, and another interesting thing that I had completely forgotten this happens. I don't think I'd ever taken notice of it before, in fact. But there was another element from this film that was applied again to Rocky IV. You see that Apollo has a small black and white newspaper picture of Rocky, tucked into a mirror, and then near the end, or right before the fight, he takes it and crumbles it up. And of course, that happened again in Rocky IV, where Rocky does that with Drago. And whether, I don't know, maybe after Rocky and Apollo became friends, Apollo told Rocky about that, and then it gave Rocky the idea to do it in part 4. I don't know. It could be an odd coincidence,
Yeah.
otherwise, but, so anyway, we get to the fight, and, it's not really that important a moment in the series, but I do like where Rocky opens the door to leave for the fight, and he has all his friends out there cheering for him.
Right.
That was cool. And, very believable also for, somebody in front of his hometown fans.
Yeah.
Especially for the people who couldn't get tickets to the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting also that, back in those days, I remember, because that came out when Muhammad Ali was at the tail end of his, run. And I remember in the days when a heavyweight title fight would be on a regular network, in prime time,
Right.
And it was not like this pay-per-view stuff, we have today.
Yeah.
So anyway, the fight takes place, and Apollo starts off, winning, of course, and
Yeah.
you see his wife there cheering, but then Rocky comes back, and of course he throws Apollo off by fighting right-handed this time.
Right.
And
what's interesting is that is something that is common from 2 and on, is that in a fight, Rocky always seems to be getting pummeled at first.
Yes.
Like he has to go through this process, and then something inside lets loose.
Yeah, it's sort of like, and of course later in the series we'll talk about the tie between the Rocky series and pro wrestling. Each seemed to influence the other, in the 80s, for better or for worse. But, because Rocky 3 had a lot to do with the rise of pro wrestling's popularity in the 80s, with its renaissance, and becoming a big national sensation. And then, meanwhile, Stallone seems to, grasp pro wrestling type storylines more and more for the sequels.
Right.
Which, of course, came to a screeching halt in the 6th one, which we'll get to later. But anyway, so, Rocky... like Hulk Hogan in his 80s pro wrestling matches, starts off badly, but that seems to energize him, and, then he gets into the later rounds, and, even though Apollo this time has pretty well controlled the fight, and his, Duke, tells him just to, don't worry about the knockdown, you're ahead on points.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, Apollo's pride, gets in the way,
Right.
as it always did. And
Which is why he was upset about and wanted the rematch anyway, because he had only won on points the first time.
Yeah, and of course this time, and in the press conference, he was saying he would take care of him in 2 rounds, which of course didn't happen. And so the match goes on, and finally we get to the last round, and Apollo's going aggressively for the knockdown. And I remember, there was, of course, there has to be a dispute between the manager and the, and Rocky and the manager, as what happened, in all 4 of the movies that ended with him in a, or of all of the 4 movies that climaxed with Rocky in an official boxing match, there was, always some dispute with somebody in his corner.
Right.
Particularly going into the last round, and of course, obviously, Mickey and Rocky in this one, they had a disagreement about when Rocky should return to fighting left-handed.
Right.
But then Apollo, obviously goes for the knockdown, and then the last round is really dramatic because there are so many, hard punches landed, and the ending, really took a lot of flack, although it ended up actually being validated many years later, which we'll get to later. But like I said, one of the fundamental differences between Part 1 and Part 6 and the 4 in between is that the 4 in between, Rockies 2 through 5, the screenplay demanded that Rocky win in the end. Whereas in 1 and 6, it was just all about just going the distance and, proving yourself against a much heavily favored fighter. And, obviously, there are, I mean, there are plenty of good underdog movies in which the good guy wins in the end, and it can work well. And I think it works well throughout the series. And there's nothing wrong with sending people home feeling good because the good guy won. But when it's a script that demands that the good guy wins, it's so hard not to fall into cliches. I mean, I've seen that in so many sports underdog movies, and I think for the most part, Stallone avoids the cliche, even in the sequels. I mean, there are times, like I said in the last episode, there are times in the sequels where some of the characters, not Rocky, but some of the characters tend to stagnate, and they're just there to do what you expect them to do. But I don't look back, even the much maligned Rocky V, which I would have changed a lot of things about, I don't look back at any of them and think that this movie is just filled with sports movie cliches,
Right. I think that probably when it was announced that, Rocky II coming out, I imagine a lot of people did get it in their heads that they were going to see Rocky knock out Apollo, which I think is what you're saying, and the fact that he didn't win in that cliche fashion, that it was going to be Rocky's big knockout.
Well,
I think that was one of the big things, because it showed again that these were two very determined fighters, both of them.
Yeah.
And, it comes up later when Apollo's talking about, the difference of a few seconds, and he was having trouble with that.
Yeah, well, 1 second to be exact, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I know what you're saying, though. Because Rocky he got, he finally stood on the 9 count. So he stayed down 1 more second, it would have been a double count out. But you think about it, though, what if Rocky had lost to Apollo in part 2, or what if he had lost to Clubber Lang in the final fight of 3, or if he had lost to Drago in 4, or if he had lost to Tommy Gunn in the street fight in 5, it just wouldn't have seemed right,
Yeah, on the other hand, for instance, if he'd lost to Apollo in Rocky 2, then if there'd been a third one, it would have sort of ended up having to be somewhat of a repeat of the second. So he had to win so that the third one could be different. In effect, so that explains with that. I think if he'd lost to Clubber Lang eventually in 3, Drago wouldn't have cared about fighting him in 4.
Right.
So you almost it had to be that way.
And not only that, but the audience could go home happy in part 1 and part 6 from Rocky just having been competitive and gone the distance. Stallone talks about he talks about the importance of giving an audience emotional payback. I feel like had Rocky lost in the climactic fight in 2 through 5, there would not have been that emotional payback. The audience would have gone home, upset,
Right, and disappointed. And like I said, I part of me feels like he had already in his head though seen the series. I think that's just how I look at it, because I think Stallone really is very close to his character.
He is, no question about it.
And I think that he did, to some degree, see, once he was doing 2, past that.
Yeah, I'm quite certain that when he made 1, he did not even envision a sequel. Because remember that, it came out in 76, so it was probably written a little before that. Because they had just started having,
But once he did the sequel, I think he was seeing past
the 1.
So
Because
to make the third one work, it had to go the way it did, too.
And of course, there's other things, like, for example, had he lost to Drago, that would have been seen as flat out un-American, because because of the era in which it came out during the height of the Cold War.
Right. And on a different level, you saw what he did to Apollo Creed. And it's like if Rocky had lost, okay, he'd be dead, or...
And that's another thing, Stallone said, and I've never heard him talk about why he chose for Mickey and Apollo to die in 3 and 4, respectively, but I remember he said that when he started working on Part 6, Adrian was originally a character, and then he decided that the film lacked emotional impact, which is why he decided for that character to have died since the last Rocky film, which had been 16 years earlier, of course. But
they said Talia Shire also didn't want to come back.
I've heard mixed stories about that. So I've heard by some sources that she did, but regardless, she did, by the way, say that she liked the film. And she even attended the premiere with Stallone and some of the others, even though she wasn't in the film, other than archive footage. But
right.
She nevertheless, she obviously she was missed, but they at the same time they still made it work without her. But the thing is, I assume that Mickey and Apollo were probably both killed off to increase the emotional impact of those films, because I mean, even if Rocky had come back and beaten Clubber Lang without his manager dying, it wouldn't have seemed quite as dramatic. Or just like Rocky beating Drago without Apollo
right, exactly.
without Apollo dying, same thing. So, but of course, the flip side of that is when you lose such an important character, that's a big space to fill, because Stallone, even though he didn't say why he killed off Mickey, at least in any interview that I've read, he did say that when they lost the character, that was very hard for the series. And but one thing that we saw in Rocky 2 that I felt at the time, then it was validated by something I read years later, but I remember thinking each of the sequels up to 4 had a level of intensity that was higher than the previous one, which which is important in a sequel, not to ever be anticlimactic. Right. And I felt like they started to lose some of the intensity in Part 5, and then later I picked up Burgess Meredith's autobiography, which came out in 1994, just 3 years before his death, and he said that he felt, as I had felt, he said he felt the intensity level picked up in every film, but started to taper off with 5. So it's interesting that he was thinking the same thing that I was,
right. And in a way, I mean, 2 wasn't as intense as the original.
In some ways it was. In some ways it wasn't. But I mean, nobody's life, for example, was ever in question in the first one.
Right.
As it was with Adrian's in Part 2. But there was one thing that I think made 2 overall more intense, is that in Part 1, even had he gone into the fight and gotten beaten in 30 seconds, he had nothing to lose anyway.
Right.
So I mean, he still got his $150,000 check. Granted, it didn't last very long, no. But life would have gone on. Whereas you feel like he has a lot more to lose in Part 2. Now that he has blown his money, and now he's got a wife and a kid to take care of. And so. And then, even on the other side, even though Apollo is never at any point in the series quite to the level of villain, of course, obviously, and that was another fundamental difference of the later sequels, that in 3, 4, and 5, you set up a villain who absolutely had to be beaten, that the script just demanded it for the common good of mankind,
Yes.
But, Apollo, he did become an antagonist in Part 2, but he never quite reached the level of villain.
Right.
And but it was a story where he within himself had a lot to lose. I mean, to the rest of the world, or at least to most of the rest of the world, he was heavyweight champion, and he was still the greatest boxer in the world, but it wasn't good enough for him, because he had to quiet his critics, and because he cared too much about the perception of
others.
And
actually, we talked about this when we were just having a private discussion, that you said the title was The Redemption, and you didn't feel that was right, as far as the Rocky character, but I pointed out that it fit more to like Apollo Creed, who was trying to get redemption.
Oh, yeah, it did, and furthermore, it also I didn't think about this until after that I rewatched the episode, but in a way it could apply to Stallone himself, because between Rocky and Rocky 2, he had several movies that bombed, And by the way, that would be the case between each of the Rocky sequels. He always had multiple bombs. And when you think about it, I mean, outside of the Rocky and Rambo series, how many Stallone movies does the public remember very well? They're not a whole lot. I mean, he says he's had some moderate hits, you know, here and there.
And my mind's flashing on him because I've seen some of them.
Oh, I have too, but I mean, they're not films that, you know...
No, but nobody,
Yeah, where you could, like, you know, ask anybody down the street, confident that they've heard of the movie, you know.
Right, exactly.
I mean, I remember I saw Cobra, which is a cop movie that he did, and I saw that, you know, in a theater when I was 16, or 15, excuse me, that was 86 that came out. Saw a couple of others. Fist, yeah, I haven't seen that. I've heard of it, though. And then Spy Kids 3D, although he played a supporting character in that. But that was one of his, between the Rockies 5 and 6, that was one of the few movies he had that was a big box office hit, although even then it was, you know, he didn't play he played a major supporting role. And it was interesting about that movie that he was actually the bad guy. Although, granted, in a comical way, right. But it was just unusual to see Stallone in that kind of character.
Yeah.
And
so he knew he could bring back a Rocky movie and have success with it, pretty much, or
yeah,
it seemed like that.
I think so, and I think, you know, I think he is close to the character, but I think a lot of times, you know, when you have a couple of bombs, you got to take the guaranteed hit. You know, I think that's human nature, and you know, and I think one thing that's unfortunate about Stallone is because he made so many. Well, he got so much fame by playing Rocky and Rambo that people he never got a chance to play intelligent characters, which I believe he could have. And in fact, there's a movie called Copland that I've never seen, but I would like to because...
I have.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah. I just... It's one of these things I can't go into much about, but Jeff and I saw that.
Because I heard that he did that movie, and he took the union minimum salary for it, because he just wanted to make, you know, that kind of movie. You know, he wanted to do a straight drama, you know. So I'd like to see it just for that reason, you know. It's kind of like, you know, like Rock Hudson back in the 60s, he made this movie called Seconds, which is a science fiction role, because he just wanted to do something that was apart from all these romantic comedies, and the film bombed, but it was a, you know, personal, I guess he got a lot of personal satisfaction out of it, just because it was so unlike anything he had done before, which of course is, well, I guess why the public didn't accept it, you know.
Well, yeah, they were looking
for
the familiar.
Right, yeah, and although the film does have a cult following now, but
so wrapping up Rocky too.
Yeah. So yeah, basically, you know, he of course, if you're still with us, you probably figured out that he does win. He becomes the heavyweight champion of the world, but the way he does it, you know, really got a lot of. It was widely criticized because, you know, he punches Apollo near the end of round 15. Mm-hmm. And they both fall down together, and they stay down, you know, they both struggle to get up, and Rocky finally gets up on the 9 count, you know, and, you know, a lot of people thought it was just a ridiculous ending, and certainly it was not something you see a lot of, but I remember reading one commentary that said, you know, this guy said he's not aware of any boxing match in which two fighters have ever fallen down at the same time, but... You know, just like I was talking about last time, you know, how much of the scenario of the original was played out in real life 15 years later when Evander Holyfield gave a club fighter named Burt Cooper a chance to, you know, win the belt, and Cooper knocked Holyfield down. Well, 10 years ago, and ironically it happened right here in Indianapolis at some small boxing club, there were these two fighters, and it was actually the first career fight for both of them. And the fight started off where they both charged at each other, each threw a punch, and contacted each other, and went down at the same time. Except this one had a less Hollywood type ending because they both were down for the count.
Oh, okay.
So it counted as a draw. But the point is, so it can happen where you have both fighters go down at the same time. It just, you know, so Stallone is a little bit of a prophet there, you know. And that's the only real life boxing match that I know of where that's ever happened. So, and then you know what's a Stallone movie without a memorable quote. You know, there aren't quite as many memorable quotes in this one as in the first, but you know, of course, it ends with "Yo, Adrian, I did it." It wasn't just "Yo, Adrian," it was "Yo, Adrian, I did it," when he was, you know, at the end of his match, and you see Adrian watching at home,
right.
with the newborn baby, because it was
and Paulie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. which is it's interesting. It's also the only one in which, you know, well, was Paulie. Paulie was there at the fight, and he was at the fight in the first one. So it's the only one where Paulie wasn't there. You know, and it's funny because, you know, that was a lot of what you know, Paulie's contributions to the, you know, some of the sequels were, where he didn't have a big role, where, you know, he was there in the corner to, you know, provide some kind of moral support, like that line right before the Drago fight, you know, where it's one of his few tender moments in the series.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah. So, you know, in conclusion, you know, Rocky 2, like you said, it was necessary. You know, it's not quite as good as the original. I don't think it's as good as I would put it. You know, and in the end, in the last episode, we're both going to rank the 6 in order. But I put it behind 3, 4, and 6. I put it a little ahead of 5, but you know, it's a worthwhile entry into the series. I think that, you know, he was able to recapture a lot of what made the original great. There were times when he got there's one thing I forgot to mention that I should have mentioned a lot earlier, but the only scene in the movie I really don't like, I mean, there's some that I think, you know, I would have done differently, but the only scene I would have thrown out is the scene where he does that commercial, and, you know, he can't read and ends up being a disaster, and he ends up walking away, and they abandon the project. And that's just where continuity becomes a little bit of an issue, because he didn't seem to have any trouble with that American Express commercial in Part 3.
Well, unless that particular incident, you know, he decided he better learn to read better.
It's possible, yeah, because there was a gap there. Maybe he took some remedial reading lessons. I don't know, but.
I mean, because you'd have to imagine he probably tried to improve himself, and I think that was something that carried through all the.
Yeah, of course, and that's one interesting aspect of 3 is that you see a much more polished Rocky who's been affected by high society living, which of course we'll get to in that episode, because that ends up being a big plot element. But yeah, I thought, you know, to me, the scene where he does the, you know, cologne or deodorant commercial or whatever it is in Part 2, I thought it was a weak scene. I thought it was just silly, you know.
Although I think that's one of those things where you do, I don't know if you see it so much now, but especially at that time, retired athletes, they were all doing commercials.
Oh, they were, yeah.
So what you were talking about, like a logical progression.
Yeah.
I think that was a logical progression that a company would try to capitalize. On his popularity.
Oh no, making the commercial itself is a realistic scenario. I just thought the whole the scene where they abandoned the commercial because he can't read. I mean, if nothing else, if they could have somebody off screen, you know.
Well, right. Ordinarily they wouldn't have abandoned it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So I just thought that's what made it silly, you know. But you know, so that's just one thing that, like I said, I should have explained it better, because doing the commercial was logical. It was just, you know, the way the scene was done, you know, I thought it was just not a realistic scenario. And him not being able to read, but you know, if it had been that bad, I mean, you know, if he had been that bad a reader, they would have had somebody, you know, standing to his side, you know, off camera, just feeding him the lines, you know, and things like that. I mean, you know, we work in film, we know how, you know, you can compensate for tough situations like that, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
And, but yeah, so yeah, we're a third of the way through the series now, and any closing thoughts, by the way, on Rocky 2? Is there anything that either of us left out?
We'll probably both think of it later tonight.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we're both silent.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so it was certainly, you know, like I said, it was an important movie to make for the series to continue, and it's one of those things. because since part 3, as we'll get to, starts off with a montage to catch us up on what's happened since the last one. I think that had they skipped part 2 and just gone to part 3, it would have just been too big a gap, because too many things happened in the intro. I mean, it's not like where you have the gap between 5 and 6, or really between 4 and 6, since 5 is largely, if not completely, ignored. For example, you've been part 6, because of the time that's elapsed, you can you could accept that a lot's been changed. But I think that had you not seen the struggles between 1 and 3, then in part 2, then part 3 just wouldn't have it wouldn't have worked as well. So
right.
It was a necessary step up the ladder, and so. All right, well, another great commentary. We made it over an hour again for the second week in a row. We're going to be a few minutes short of last time, but we'll be back in probably sometime next week, and start talking about Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, and but what a film that we'll be reviewing a film though that is a little bit cartoonish, but it really is one of my, I think it's one of the better films in the series, which is Rocky 3, and also we'll be talking about Survivor 2, since they make their debut in the series with their song Eye of the Tiger, which really is one of the best uses of rock music ever in a film, I think. Excited to do these next 4 episodes. So as always, thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to like this video. Feel free to share this video also, and to like Super Deep Movie Analysis on Facebook. And we will be back again in the near future for Rocky 3. Until then, for Michelle Gussow, this is Lec Zorn. Good night.